We have as partners several of the nation's leading experts on First Lady fashion, and you were given literature for each of the 6 speakers that describes each of the 6 speaker presentations going through early September. Over the next 6 weeks, they'll present multiple programs. The individuals will examine the significance behind First Lady's fashion choices in a way never done before. But first, we must recognize 2 people that were critical to the process. Cheryl Sarmi of the Richard Nixon Foundation, and Olivia Anastasiadis of the National Archives for their partnership, vision, and passion. It's an honor now for me to introduce Carl Anthony. We simply could not have produced the exhibition without Carl's leadership. Carl's the nation's leading expert not only on First Ladies' fashion, but on the roles First Ladies have played in the White House dating back to Martha Washington. He's the author of a dozen books on the political and popular cultural influence of presidential spouses and families, and he served as a speechwriter for Nancy Reagan and a ghostwriter for Betty Ford. Carl, it's an honor to again welcome you to the Richard Nixon Presidential Library.
Thank you very much, Bill, and also to members of the board and the staff of the Richard Nixon Foundation, which has made all of this possible. And I would also like to add my thanks to both Olivia Anastasiadis, the curator with the National Archives here, and also Cheryl Sarmi, the secretary. Hardly a title that really captures all that she does. It really is wonderful because it was the seed of all of this came about through, I believe, really the great personal relationship between Cheryl and Olivia, personal and professional, and it was from that a great enthusiasm was really worked up. And so when Cheryl first called me about this, and said it would be about First Lady's fashions and so forth, I told her I wasn't interested because I wasn't really interested or didn't have a knowledge of fashion per se. And I say that with all great, enormous respect to that industry, but it's sort of like building an automobile or a house. It's a whole world unto itself. The structure, the art of it, the manufacturing, the marketing. But I began to think while we were speaking on the phone about the fact that I so often received phone calls from the media about First Lady's clothing, and what I always was interested in, because it's of course a big part of the history of the presidency through the First Ladies, is the political impact and the popular culture impact of what they wore. And it was Christine Mickey of the National Archives staff. We were in the early stages of this, and we were talking, a whole group of the 2 staffs, and she was the one who thought perhaps it might be better entitled, instead of what they wore, as to its current title, why they wore it. Because there's really 2 parts to the telling of this story. There was both the intention of these women, and then something entirely out of their control, the media and public reaction to what they wear. What's always amusing when you study history is at a certain point you recognize that although people might have worn bonnets and driven in buggies, and that today we may have soon enough self-driving cars and are able to take photographs and send them around the world on a phone, that the essential nature of human beings changes actually very little. And you also see and this is a very important part of this story, how technology, communications, really plays a central role. When we go back to the very first day that we had a First Lady making a public appearance in May of 1789, when Martha Washington finally arrived in New York a month after her husband had been inaugurated as the first president. It's fascinating to note that a newspaper, the Daily, I think we call it the Daily Intelligencer and Advertiser, made note of the fact that Martha Washington was wearing clothing that had been made in her country. And it went on to say it reflected, you know, the good values and solid craftsmanship of American-made clothing. It was no mistake. In a letter George Washington wrote about a year later to a friend of theirs, he made it clear that in public, he and his wife would only be dressing in American-made clothing. Now, this was largely, at that time, Martha Washington was seen by the public, by and large, at her private receptions. They were somewhat open to the public, but it was still something more on a sort of a social referral. And it was a weekly reception, and she would receive guests on a dais, a bit like, you know, the heads of Europe. And as you've all seen, most especially in the famous life portrait of her by Gilbert Stuart, which is used on our opening banner for the exhibit, she wore what we might almost call Washington white all the time. She always wore those white caps, those white mob caps, and she usually wore a white scarf around her neck, and it was intended to signify the purity and essentially the sort of thoroughness of this new form of government, of a democracy. But what's also interesting is among the accessories she wore was an amber necklace, and amber was associated with classical Greece. And so there were a lot of allusions made by Martha Washington to ancient Greece, of course, the first democracy. I will today be covering basically 171 years in about 25 minutes. So I won't have an opportunity to talk about every single one of the First Ladies, which will, in this series, I will be covering 1789 today to 61, the Kennedy inaugural. And next week, Pamela Keogh will be speaking about Jacqueline Kennedy and Nancy Reagan. And each of our subsequent speakers will also be covering two First Ladies each up to the present. But I will today give you some glimpses, I think, of the more significant First Ladies who used clothing to send a message, a political message, and those to whom there was great reaction to and much interpreted about them. Dolly Madison is probably the most important in the early years. Even though Martha Washington and Abigail Adams assumed a public role, they were a little bit uncomfortable with it, and it was really just by and large at receptions that they appeared. Dolly Madison saw her role as liaison to the general public. She appeared at all kinds of events outside of the White House. Now, of course, Thomas Jefferson, who was president for 8 years, was a widower, and occasionally his daughter, Martha Randolph, came up from Virginia. 2 of his 8 years as president, she was there in the White House. But Dolly Madison, as the wife of the Secretary of State, was there, and of course she and her husband were adherents of Jeffersonian democracy. In so many ways, President Jefferson would do little things to signify equality or the sense of egalitarianism. For example, using round tables where there was nobody at the head of the table and nobody at the end of the table, but everyone was equal. Dolly Madison very much believed in this, but she also recognized the fact that in early Washington, diplomats from European nations were coming and kind of looking down their nose at this new capital in the crude countryside of what was then a new city, Washington, D.C. And so she very consciously created a costume for herself, because realizing that there were few actual symbols of this new country, she essentially turned herself into a living symbol of the new nation. And in wanting to both earn the respect for the United States and suggest that this new nation was on an equal footing with the old world of Holland and France and England, that she had to somehow convey this visually without verbally making the point, and yet also prove to be democratic. She certainly proved to be democratic in her behavior, in the way she interacted with people. She was friendly, she was gregarious, she was approachable, and she held these famous Wednesday evenings, which were called crushes, because they were open houses at the White House. But she dressed in clothing largely imported from Europe, and in a French style that was, for many of the older Federalists, a little bit too risque, a little too revealing. But it was also in the Napoleonic style, in the French style. And of course, that emulated Jeffersonian democracies. I should say, Jeffersonian democracy emulated the new post-monarchy in France. So Mrs. Madison would wear bright, bright colors. And instead of wearing a crown, she came up with the idea of wearing a turban. In fact, that became her trademark. And just so you would never fail to know where she was in these crowded rooms, she would often wear long birds of paradise feathers in the turban. But in fact, almost all of her portraits, I think except two, certainly painted while she was First Lady, are all painted with her turbans. And as to the fact that she wore these low-cut dresses that were a little bit scandalous, it's really kind of extraordinary when you think of the fact that she had been a Quaker and had been raised as a Quaker and used to being all covered up and wearing grays and dark colors. In fact, at one of her receptions, she encountered a friend, a gentleman who had also once been from the same meeting house that she and her family had attended in Philadelphia, and he had left, and she looked at him and said, "Brother, where is thy broad brim?" meaning his hat. And he looked at her chest and he said, "Sister, where is thy kerchief?" So, Dolly Madison, though, but what's also very interesting is to keep in mind the fact that the general American public didn't know what Mrs. Madison looked like, because there were not yet newspaper descriptions of her clothing, and it actually wasn't until 1817, the year she left the role of First Lady, that an engraving of her was reproduced on the cover of a magazine called the Portfolio magazine, printed in Philadelphia. As you move along, you also see the contentious election of 1828, when the incumbent president, John Quincy Adams, from the old, Massachusetts aristocracy, and his wife, Louisa Adams, was born in Europe, very continental, and dressed very stylishly, although on a very limited budget. We find in her letters that she made her own makeup and she would use the same dresses, but she would simply remake them by adding different accessories. But the candidate that opposed President Adams that year was Andrew Jackson from Tennessee. And Jackson, of course, really represented an enormous change in the country. He represented the poorer working class, those who had migrated to the West, a lot of them first generation like himself, Scotch-Irish who had gone to Kentucky or Tennessee, and his wife Rachel, although from a very prominent family in Tennessee, was back in Washington considered very prude, that somehow she would not fit in with at least the East Coast's idea and the Southern aristocracy's idea of what a First Lady should be. And one finds examples in the newspaper at the time of descriptions of Mrs. Adams' clothing, which are actually the very first written newspaper descriptions of a First Lady's apparel, but also her remark that she understands Mrs. Jackson dresses in homespun. You know, so this was sort of a popular thing. As it turns out, Mrs. Jackson died a month after her husband's election, but before his inauguration, and her niece, Emily Donaldson, served as First Lady. And we have two records which indicate that Mrs. Donaldson received guests at the White House at one reception wearing calico. And calico had been adopted as a symbol of the Jacksonian Party. So you see the political parties already using not so much colors, but in this case patterns or certain kinds of fabrics to indicate political loyalty. Angelica Van Buren is the daughter-in-law of Martin Van Buren, and who followed Andrew Jackson. And she was from a wealthy South Carolina family, educated in Philadelphia, a very kind of progressive education where the elite of the whole country were gathered, whether they were Jewish or Catholic or Protestant or Quaker. And so she had sort of a very worldly view. And she married the president's son. Van Buren was a widower 2 years into his presidency and took a honeymoon in Europe and was welcomed in England and France as an American princess, because their idea of a presidential family, you know, was still new, so that's what they equated her with. And when she came back, she kind of thought that too. And so she received on a dais, and she would wear 3 feathers in her hair. And one of the Whig Party spokesmen delivered a very famous speech, Congressman Charles Ogle of Pennsylvania, when Van Buren was seeking re-election. Now, what happens is, during Van Buren's administration, is the Panic of 1837, this huge, terrible, lingering economic depression. And so people are really suffering. And meanwhile, there's reports of President Van Buren ordering gold spoons and new china, and his daughter-in-law, although she's not named particularly, there was still this sort of propriety about, you know, going after a woman in the family, although I guess Mrs. Jackson was game, but in the case of Mrs. Van Buren, she's just kind of obliquely referred to as, you know, a member of the family traveling through Europe, who thinks of herself as a crown head of Europe. And her White House portrait shows her in the court costume that she wore when she was received at Buckingham Palace. And Van Buren went down in defeat. And in large part, it was because of that speech. So you begin to see that what a First Lady wore could also very much, in the wrong time, or I suppose the right time, depending on whether you're trying to unseat the guy in the White House, could really work against a president. Few examples, I think, bring all of these elements together better than Mary Todd Lincoln. because Mrs. Lincoln came to Washington, again, as a Westerner in the tradition of Jackson. Although she was extremely well educated, she spoke French, she studied astronomy, she could quote Victor Hugo from memory, and was highly political. And when she first became First Lady, she spoke to the Secretary of State and her husband about the fact that she wanted to buy imported clothing. And they told her, no, that with the onset of the war, the Civil War, that the import tariffs were too great, and then it would be more beneficial to the economy for her to just buy from, made within the United States. So she had a regular dressmaker, a very famous woman, a freed slave who became her great confidant, Elizabeth Keckley, and it's a fascinating story unto itself. But Mrs. Lincoln, of course, was often in New York buying other things like gloves and fans and other accessories. And she quite literally took her husband's advice a bit to quite an extreme, to the point where she ran up what is, I believe, the modern equivalence of close to $300,000 in debt, just largely on clothing. And she was terrified as he sought re-election, because she knew that if he didn't win, that the creditors would come after her. And so she came up with two plans to fund her clothing. One was to have the manure at the White House stables gathered and sold as fertilizer, White House fertilizer. The other was to go back to all of those Republicans that had worked through her to get really lucrative jobs through the system, and basically say, you know, you owe me a percentage of your salary because you really wouldn't have that job were it not for me and were it not for the president. Neither of these plans worked, and of course, she felt, however, very strongly about her clothing. She felt she had to represent the prosperity of the Union and of the Union Army. Because you have to remember, in Washington, Washington was essentially a southern city. It had been acculturated that way, and it was, although a lot of the Southerners left the capital with the onset of the war, it still had a sort of Southern spirit. There were still Southerners there, and people were really, I mean, you know, the stories are legion, very nasty about Mrs. Lincoln. Everything she did was criticized and attacked. You do begin to see, for the first time, very detailed descriptions of what Mrs. Lincoln wore. And at this time, you also see, for the first time, in the weekly illustrated newspapers, full-length drawings of Mrs. Lincoln. And that started just briefly with Harriet Lane, who was the niece of the Bachelor president, James Buchanan, right before Lincoln. She was the first who you begin to see in these illustrated. I don't think it's any mistake that one of the two great publishers of these weekly illustrateds was a man called Frank Leslie, who had started out as an American. He was from a British-born, but he started out as an American publisher of what were called fashion plates, you know, which were in Europe at the time, in France and in England. And in fact, that's how a lot of Americans, both men and women, saw what was, you know, the current vogue in England and France, was through these publications. Sometimes it'd even be hand-tinted. And that's how they were able to order clothing from overseas. But Frank Leslie published the very first American fashion plate. He stopped doing that, but then went into his weekly illustrated news. But you see the first ladies appearing in particularly his paper. And as time moves on, the technology begins to grow, because of course photography starts in 1844. Julia Tyler is the first to be photographed. Harriet Lane is the first to have her photograph reproduced and sold on these little things called carte de visite, meaning reference to like a visiting card. It was really just like a business card. It was a tiny sized piece of cardboard on which photographs were printed and pasted, and the public could buy them. And that's when you began to see the onset of these large photo albums, where people would put these in. And during the Civil War, you know, there was no Hollywood in those days, so really the only public figures, the only celebrities were, you know, authors, military leaders, and the president and his family, and other high political figures. The interest in what First Ladies wore really does begin to take off in the industrial age. You come to somebody like Julia Grant, who some people very unkindly compared to looking like a piece of furniture, because her gowns were festooned with beads and bows and bugles and ran in every different direction and had every possible color. It was just no place for the eye to rest. And her husband, you know, President Grant, was also a little bit concerned about it. Mrs. Grant would sometimes wear these very low-cut sort of dresses, and you know, she got very offended by her husband, thinking he had a right to tell her what to wear, and she issued one of the very first press releases ever made, statements to the press, when she was asked about, you know, setting an example, and she said something that I think you've seen repeated with First Ladies throughout the years, which is to say, I am not going to dictate what people should wear. People should wear what they want to wear and what they think looks best on them. And clearly, she thought what she wore would look best on her. But you see, within the Republican Party at the time, the schisms that, you know, inevitably occur with both parties, and you have Grant with a lot of these political scandals, a lot of appointees from New York, a lot of them friends with the robber barons. Mrs. Grant took a lot of gifts without realizing strings were attached, and a lot of it was from the New York Republican Party. And at the time, the two great power bases of the Republican Party were Ohio and New York. And although Grant had been born in Ohio, you know, the Grants were really associated with the New York crowd. His successor was Rutherford B. Hayes, the governor. And you couldn't have found two radically different women than Lucy Hayes and Julia Grant. In fact, on Inauguration Day, one reporter sitting watching Mrs. Hayes as the ceremony is going on gave a very detailed pen description, and it just, you know, broke into rhapsody to the point that she described her as looking like the Virgin Mary. You know, and talking about her hairstyle as evokes the Madonna herself, and you know, people got very tired of that very quickly. There were a lot of newspaper and public reaction to Mrs. Hayes, who was a devout Methodist and you know, banned alcohol from the White House, and would have, you know, Sunday hymn singing, and people, you know, really started criticizing her for that you know, that it wasn't a very social house. And this is an era when you see morality, when you see the clothing of First Ladies really taking on, you know, questions of morality. And that is really culminates with Frances Cleveland, the 21-year-old woman who was a bride in the White House, and who liked to wear very low-cut dresses and bare her arms. And she was, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which had really been fans of Lucy Hayes and donated, Mrs. Hayes' portrait to the White House, where there's a water, jug coming out because she only served water and soft drinks. They went after Mrs. Cleveland and petitioned her and said she was setting an immoral example for the young women of the country. And Mrs. Cleveland just kept wearing the low-cut dresses. But you are, again, looking at what else is going on. The technology. Finally, photographs can now be reproduced in magazines on the finer linen paper. And just a few years later, 1901, you see Ida McKinley, who succeeded Mrs. Cleveland. Very fuzzy image, but it's the first known photograph of her in a newspaper. Simultaneous to that are, you start to see Mrs. McKinley captured on film. She's the very first lady who is seen in the very early motion pictures, moving pictures as they call them. And that really begins to affect and accelerate the public interest in what first ladies are wearing. Jumping ahead a little bit then, you come, say, to the 1920s and the important benchmark of women gaining the right to vote. And Mrs. Harding is in the White House. Now, Mrs. Harding is one of the oldest women to become First Lady, but in spirit, she captures, the Roaring '20s. She's the first to fly in an airplane. She is fascinated by the movie camera. She has the first radio in the White House. She invites movie stars to the White House. She does public appearances. She's an advocate, a radical advocate for animal protection. In fact, coming out even against vivisection, 1921. She is also an outspoken suffragist, and she begins to wear clothing, although it's appropriate for her, it's a stylized version of what young women are wearing at the time, the very early beginnings of what later became thought of as the flapper look. Mrs. Harding hired the first named designer, a man by the name of Harry Collins, and he was a theatrical costume designer. And so she wore his clothes, and it really attracted a lot of attention. She, again, like Mrs. Grant said when she was asked about how short women should dress and how short young girls should be allowed to dress, she said, I'm going to leave that to the wisdom of the individual to make that decision. She had a bit of she was a little bit self-conscious about her neck, and so she would wear a black velvet neck collar and put a diamond sunburst there to sort of, I suppose, either bring attention to the diamond or attention away from her neck, but in a way to try and sort of, appear younger. And the irony of it is that that became popular with young women at the time, and that was called a Flossie Cling. Now, her maiden name had been Cling, and her name was Florence, so they started calling those Flossie Clings, and they became popular. Her immediate successor, Grace Coolidge, is really fascinating when it comes to this subject, because we think of the Coolidges as, they were very parsimonious Yankees from Vermont. They had a farm, and the president worked on the farm, and his family farm. Mrs. Coolidge, was famous for, her blueberry muffin recipe, and she was very domestic. And yet, she was also college educated and worked as a teacher of the deaf, and was a real advocate for women seeking full education. And And yet, when you begin to see what she dressed in, they were extravagant, and they were really stylish. And I think in many ways, she's the first lady, in some ways a modern first lady, in the sense that she reminded me almost a little bit of Michelle Obama, in that she was very aware of what was in vogue, and very and updated her wardrobe, you know, all the time. In fact, during an interview I had once with Betty Ford, Mrs. Ford told me that as a young girl, she remembered how important Mrs. Coolidge had been to her mother in dictating. At one time, people would look to first ladies during the 20s and 30s for a sense of what was the right style, you know, to sort of be appropriate and proper, and yet at the same time stylish. And I should also mention that, of course, Mrs. Coolidge becomes the first lady whose voice we hear. So now we've seen, you know, Mrs. Wilson during World War I, Mrs. Harding and Mrs. Coolidge in the 20s, and what they're wearing in newsreels, in movie houses. Mrs. Hoover we hear on the radio, and every Sunday the nation hears Eleanor Roosevelt on the radio. And the nation not only hears Mrs. Roosevelt, but a lot of the nation actually saw Mrs. Roosevelt. She was very rarely at the White House. She was constantly on the move. This during the Great Depression, and of course, she assumed famously the role of eyes and ears of the president. And she saw an opportunity when World War II, well, when the war broke out in Europe, an opportunity for American manufacturing, American fashion industry. And she was very much, you know, she's a supporter of the ladies' garment union, but she also, for all of her social activism, took enormous pride in the fact that she was named to a best dressed list. When she made these public appearances, of course, around the country, she knew that the public wanted a little touch of elegance. They were expecting it from First Lady. And she was, you know, in trains and planes, and drove her own car. So she always brought, except in the hottest winter days, this fur piece. And people later spoke about, you know, that fur piece was, you know, pretty ratty by the time the Roosevelt years ended. But people loved it, and little kids would come up and, you know, want to touch it. And Mrs. Roosevelt, though, was very practical. If she liked a dress, she would order from a store called Arnold Constable in New York, and would order, you know, 5 copies in different colors. I'm going to wrap up by just briefly touching on these last two in this segment, Bess Truman and Mamie Eisenhower. Bess Truman may likely be the most diligently unfashionable first lady we've ever had. And she insisted on wearing a basic uniform of plum and navy blue. And it was pretty much unvarying. And you see her during her ceremonial role as First Lady. She's never smiling, almost never smiling. And she especially hated movie cameras. But she's always in the dark clothing, and she wore grays and browns. And she did that for a reason. She didn't want press attention. And she knew that if she wore something very plain and similar to what she wore the last time, that reporters would have nothing to say about her. In contrast is Mamie Eisenhower, who, you know, had lived in Europe, had been the wife of a 5-star general, but who thought of herself as a neighbor, and really was, in many ways, neighborly. And she, of course, famously helps unwittingly to make pink the most popular color, according to the Color Institute at the time, in textiles and home goods, refrigerators, you know, tiles, spatulas. everything is being made in Mamie Pink, or First Lady Pink, as it was called. But what she ended up doing, again, also unwittingly, is generating a boom in these, a mini boom in the economies of specialty markets of accessories. So, for example, her inaugural gown had all these brilliants sewn into them, these sparkles. There was a run on those, and suddenly, you know, the wholesale distributors, you know, reporting record sales of that. When the main fur trappers were really hurting, and they were seeing that people were buying mink and not beaver coats, they came up with the idea of giving Mrs. Eisenhower a beaver coat. And it created a big political controversy, first of all, for her accepting something free. Then the senator from Maine, a Republican, Margaret Chase Smith, was angry that the fur trappers, you know, did not go through her, although when they first approached her, she said she wouldn't approach Mrs. Eisenhower. But anyway, Mrs. Eisenhower accepted it, and sure enough, you know, there was a boom in the Maine. Fur trappers were reporting record sales themselves. And Mrs. Eisenhower always wore these like sort of little straw hats. She was famous for her hats. To the point where those became so popular that, and the straw was imported from Ecuador, that it is reported by the curator of the Eisenhower Library that it practically pretty much saved the Ecuadorian economy. So this is just an overview of the topic. I've obviously left a lot out. There were a lot of more detailed political controversies. You can read all about it in the book that we've put out to accompany the exhibit. And I'm eager to take any questions any of you may have.
Thank you, Carl. As you can all see, Carl is just a wealth of knowledge on First Ladies. We could go up here for hours and hours and hours, but I think you're getting hungry. I'm getting hungry as well. You got a brochure on the way in here. This is just one of 7 in the series. I encourage you to come back to all of them. They are all not only experts like Carl, but each individual speaker has a specific niche that I think you'll really get a kick out of. Read about it, each of our speakers. And of course, Carl will be back for our last one to have a focus on Pat Nixon. We are going to take a couple of questions, but before we get into Q&A, I know some of you may have noticed a big grand exhibit case covered with a black linen out on the runway. We're going to unveil that with Carl, and is Cheryl in the room? Cheryl Sarabee? Well, I'm going to try and spring this on Cheryl. I want her to be part of the unveiling if she can hear me. She'll say no, but we'll force her to do it. But our first question will come from this gentleman in the back. You guys think of some other ones? If you have one, come to me, raise your hand. We will go for a little bit, but we do have to move to lunch here shortly. So our first question.
What type of fabric and material did the first garments that the First Ladies wore comprised of?
I don't know. That is an area, I remember silk being mentioned all the time. But you see, that's the part of this subject I don't, cotton linen. But also, actually, when you ask that right now, it also makes me think, you know, Jefferson's daughter, in support of the Embargo Act, started to make homespun, cotton homespun at Monticello. And a lot of those, the women who were supportive of the Democratic Republican Party in Jefferson, in support of the Embargo Act, would do this. It was, and broadcloth. Now broadcloth is made of cotton. Okay, so there's a...
It's going to be organic. It's going to be wool. It's going to be silk. It's going to be cotton. Did I miss something? So we're talking organic material. Back then they would grow. You'd have wool. You'd have cotton. You'd have silks, linen, cotton linen. So those basic sort of fabrics you will find, and that's why they last so long. And then you jump in between, and the modern ones are metallics, synthetics, rayons, which are crushables, are easy wear, and those last forever too. And so that's the range in fabrics.
And there's an interesting, and there's a, like I said, they can only talk about it so much, but there's an interesting thing with dealing with Mrs. Hoover during the Depression and the cotton industry, which was really hurting. And at the time, we were beginning to import rayon from Japan. And the big fear was that there was going to be the American manufacturer coming up with a blend between cotton. They were blending cotton with rayon. And Mrs. Hoover was wearing this, and oh my God, it became a practical international incident. And the Japanese ambassador, had to talk to President Hoover about it. So, so you do see that, and I know with Mrs. Nixon, you see especially a lot of those blends that she would refer to as the non-crushables, which were practical because of all the traveling she did.
Our next question will come from the front row here, but I want to acknowledge Olivia Anastasiadis for giving her input. Olivia is the curator here that put an incredible amount of thought, time, and work into that runway just outside here in the hall, and a display in the main galleries. If you haven't gotten in there, make sure you get in there to see them. Those are all Pat Nixon's dresses. But
Cheryl Richard from the Bowers Museum over here, and Sandy Kern, who is a fabulous costume designer, and she works on Broadway, dressing ladies, dressing costumes too.
So we'll do two more. The next one will come from the front row here, and then I'm going to ask the last one, if that's okay with you.
Thanks, Carl, for being here. It's an honor to have you. A couple things. So you talked about how Martha Washington intentionally wore American-made clothes. When did First Ladies start wearing, say, different regional materials from other countries for diplomatic reasons?
That's a very good question, because there's always the issue, especially in the 19th century, of are we a private person or are we a public person? And where does that line begin and end? So, for example, Dolly Madison bought, we have records of her buying most of her items from Paris through the American representative in Paris, who complained about having to, waddle through the streets of Paris going after everything on Mrs. Madison's checklist. You have Sarah Polk, again, another interesting one we not enough time to get into, because there was a bit of a dark side there, because she had these very wealthy cotton plantations, all by the labor of enslaved people, and wore lavish clothing all from the House of Worth in Paris, and was criticized for, although she held herself out as a very pious woman, she always arrived fashionably late for church, and some of the press accounts I have really criticized her for overdressing. But it was all, not all, but what we know of from what's in the Polk collection down in the Polk Museum in Columbia, Tennessee, from the House of Worth. You see Frances Cleveland still doing that. And some of these were clothes, in the cases of Edith Wilson, Frances Cleveland, and Sarah Polk, all bought from the House of Worth in Paris, but those were clothes they bought right before they became First Lady. So we don't really have a record, per se, of them buying, overseas clothing. Really, the first real record of that, on the record that we have, is Jackie Kennedy, 1961, when she makes the first state trip with President Kennedy in May to Paris, and she has Givenchy design the gown that she wore to the palace at Versailles for the performance hosted by President de Gaulle.
So for our last question, Carl, you mentioned the book, which I might note is going to be available in the East Room for sale, and Carl is going to be able to sign it if you want to pick one up. There's a discount too of 10% for however many you buy. But I know you went into pretty deep detail on all of the First Ladies in that book. One in particular, Pat Nixon. Can you tell me, in your exploration of the subject, what fascinated you the most on First Lady Pat Nixon?
Well, this is something I'll just mention in a general way right now, because I'm really going to get into great depth in it. In the last lecture, I'm just going to focus on her and Mrs. Ford. But, I've written about Mrs. Nixon before, and by the way, it's kind of funny being up here right now, because the one and only time that I saw Mrs. Nixon and we made contact with each other, although it was not an opportunity to talk, was the night before the dedication of the Nixon Library in 1990. And I had at that point written my 2 books on First Ladies and worked through Julie Eisenhower, who helped me, who was a friend, and she would ask her mother questions that I would send. And Helen Smith, who had been Mrs. Nixon's press secretary. So they knew I was going to be here. Julie invited me to the opening. Mrs. Nixon knew I was going to be here. She was in frail health. But Helen Smith had told her Carl was here in the audience, and he'll be sitting next to me. And so when they first came out, she saw me, and we acknowledged each other. So it's really kind of interesting to be here, because this is right where she was. There is something that I think that film that we saw, you can't watch that film and not be really moved practically every second, because that story is something else, man. I mean, that is a story of, somebody deciding that they are not going to fail in life. They are going to succeed in life through education, and that nothing is going to get in the way of it. And it's so, there's so many layers to her story. What is the most fascinating thing, though, about her is, Nixon's come in January 1969. The women's movement is ostensibly begun, at least in the public mind, in October, a month before Nixon's elected. The Miss America contest, when you have all the women protesters and, burning their bras, and all this sort of stage stuff that's done to draw press attention. And, the miniskirt, women are wearing miniskirts at the time. And so I began to do research for this book and really look into this and with Mrs. Nixon. And you see that Mrs. Nixon liked the miniskirt. And the reason she did was because she was once with her 2 daughters while they were buying clothing during the campaign. With its designer by the name of Vincent Mignon. And Julie and her mom were the same size, and Julie said her mom liked a dress on her, and she said, why don't you try it on? And she did, and so I'll get more into that, but what is really fascinating is we call that chapter the California Girl in Pants, because you really see how early on, long before she even thought she'd be a public figure, she liked wearing pants. When she worked at Bullock's Wilshire, she was at that point a junior at USC, and in a letter she wrote to her aunt back in New York, she was telling about the job, but she said, I wear pants, and everybody complains because they want to see my legs, but I really don't care. I like wearing pants. And, we're talking the 1930s. Maybe Katharine Hepburn was a public figure wearing. But even before that, even as a young girl, one of the photographs that's shown, and it's a picture we use in the book, when she's not probably more than 14, 15 years old with two of her girlfriends. One of those days, very rare days, that she had to enjoy life. You know, sometimes they take the streetcar and they make their way out to the beach for a day, but this is on a water tower, and you know, this whole area was rural, all the citrus farms, and you know, her family had a farm, and so you know, you see these three girls who have climbed this water tower, and somebody else has got a brownie and is taking pictures of them. And it's not a day when she's working. She's not in a pair of you know, dirty overalls from working on the farm, but she's wearing a pair of pants. So, you know, and then of course, I will go into that whole story in the last lecture about how she becomes the first lady to publicly wear pants. And she does it very definitively, and there are 4 occasions when she does it, so it's, you know, you can't say it's just a coincidence. And of course, at the time, it's still a bit controversial. Even her husband, the president, you know, tries to discourage women who work at the White House from wearing these, and she's not wearing them at the White House, but she wore one in a campaign poster for re-election in '72. So it's that really, to me, is a fascinating look at her. And of course, the book really does go into great depth on Mrs. Nixon in that way. Anyway.
Carl, thank you.